Sometimes the deepest humiliation is not being shouted at in public. It is watching everyone decide you are worthless before you have spoken a single word. On an unusually warm Thursday afternoon, the polished glass entrance of Hawthorne Plaza reflected a cloudless Chicago sky, while hundreds of office workers hurried through revolving doors with coffee cups, laptop bags, and impatient expressions. Business suits blended into the steady rhythm of downtown life until one unexpected scene stopped nearly everyone in their tracks. A woman wearing an elegant charcoal business suit was being escorted out of the building by two security officers. She was not yelling. She was not resisting. She simply stood with quiet dignity while another man in an expensive tailored suit pointed toward the sidewalk and spoke loudly enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "You no longer have authorization to enter this building. Please leave the property." Phones immediately appeared in every direction. Some people whispered. Others quietly laughed. A few employees shook their heads as if they had already decided the entire story without knowing a single fact. The woman lowered her eyes for only a brief moment before lifting her chin again. Although disappointment rested behind her calm expression, she refused to let humiliation steal her composure. Across the street, Ethan Carter climbed down from a maintenance ladder after replacing a damaged exterior light fixture at the residential building directly across from Hawthorne Plaza. At 38 years old, Ethan had spent most of his adult life fixing things other people overlooked. Broken doors, faulty elevators, leaking pipes, loose handrails, small problems that became dangerous only after everyone ignored them for too long. His work shirt carried faint signs of another long day, but his blue eyes still held the quiet patience that had carried him through years of raising his 8-year-old daughter, Lucy, alone. He noticed the crowd first, then the cameras. Finally, he noticed the woman standing completely alone after the security officers stepped back inside and the revolving doors closed behind her. The expensive suit she wore no longer seemed important. Neither did the polished leather heels resting on the concrete beneath her feet. What Ethan saw instead was someone trying very hard not to let strangers witness her heartbreak. Without thinking about titles, status, or consequences, he crossed the sidewalk carrying his small toolbox in one hand. Several bystanders looked at him with quiet curiosity. One young man even muttered, "She probably deserves whatever happened." Ethan never answered. He had learned long ago that assumptions were usually louder than truth. When he reached the woman, he stopped several feet away to avoid invading her space. His voice remained soft enough that only she could hear. "Ma'am," he asked gently, "are you all right?" For the first time since she had been forced outside, someone looked directly into her eyes instead of at her clothes or the building behind her. She blinked slowly, almost surprised by the question itself. "I am not sure," she admitted quietly. Ethan nodded as though her answer made perfect sense. "Do you need to sit down for a minute?" She hesitated before giving the smallest nod. At that exact moment, the afternoon breeze carried a folded sheet of paper from her hand across the sidewalk. Ethan caught it before it disappeared beneath a passing taxi. He handed it back without reading a single word. She accepted it with a grateful smile that lasted only a second before fading again. Neither of them noticed the name printed across the top of the document. Neither of them realized dozens of office windows above were still watching. And Ethan certainly did not know that the quiet woman standing beside his building was the chief executive officer whose name was displayed on the very top floor of the tower that had just thrown her out. The woman accepted Ethan's invitation with a quiet nod, and together they crossed the narrow street toward the residential building where he worked. The polished office towers behind them reflected afternoon sunlight like giant mirrors, but the modest brick building in front of them offered something far more comforting than expensive architecture. It offered a place where nobody cared about executive titles. Ethan opened the front door and stepped aside. "After you," he said politely. She hesitated for only a moment before walking inside. The lobby smelled faintly of fresh coffee and recently cleaned floors. A retired couple chatted near the mailboxes while a young mother pushed a stroller toward the elevator. Nobody looked twice at the elegantly dressed stranger. They simply smiled the same way neighbors smiled at everyone who walked through those doors. Ethan placed his toolbox beside the front desk and motioned toward a small seating area near the window. "Please, have a seat. I will be right back." Before she could answer, he disappeared into a nearby maintenance office. She lowered herself into the chair and slowly released a breath she had been holding since security escorted her outside. For the first time that afternoon, the noise of the city seemed distant. She stared through the window toward the office tower across the street where her entire world had changed less than 30 minutes earlier. She reached into her jacket pocket, searching for her phone, only to remember it had remained inside her office when access to the building was suddenly revoked. Her wallet was missing as well. Even her identification badge had been disabled before she reached the lobby. She closed her eyes briefly. Never in her career had she imagined becoming a stranger to the very building where she had spent years leading thousands of employees. A cheerful young voice interrupted her thoughts. "Dad, I am done with my homework." Lucy Carter skipped into the lobby carrying a colorful backpack almost as large as she was. Her bright smile immediately found Ethan returning from the office with 2 steaming paper cups and a small lunch container. "Perfect timing," Ethan said. "Come meet someone." Lucy walked over without hesitation. "Hello," she said politely. "I am Lucy." The woman smiled for the first time that afternoon. "Hello, Lucy." Ethan handed 1 cup to the woman. "It is only regular coffee from the break room, but it is hot." She accepted it with both hands. "Thank you." Ethan sat across from her instead of beside her, giving her comfortable space. "I am sorry I cannot offer anything fancier." She looked down at the simple white paper cup before quietly answering. "This may be the kindest thing anyone has offered me today." Lucy opened the lunch container and frowned slightly. "Dad, there is enough for 3. Ethan smiled. "Then I suppose we should not let it go to waste." Inside were 2 homemade turkey sandwiches, apple slices, and oatmeal cookies prepared early that morning. Ethan divided everything evenly without a second thought. The woman watched him carefully. He never asked who she was. He never questioned why she had been removed from the office tower. He never searched the internet for her name. He simply shared what little he had because someone appeared to need it. After several quiet minutes, she looked at Ethan with genuine curiosity. Most people would have walked away. Ethan took a sip of coffee before answering. "Maybe, but I keep thinking about something my father told me when I was young." Lucy smiled because she already knew the words. Ethan continued softly. "He said people usually remember how you treated them on the worst day of their lives. That is why those days matter the most." The woman lowered her eyes, suddenly unable to speak. Across the street, several black luxury vehicles slowly turned the corner toward the office tower, while inside the quiet residential lobby, the woman who had lost nearly everything that afternoon found herself surrounded by something infinitely more valuable than authority. She found ordinary kindness from a man who still had no idea that the stranger sharing his daughter's homemade lunch was the chief executive officer of the company, now searching the city for its missing leader. The quiet afternoon inside the residential lobby unfolded with a pace that felt completely different from the frantic world outside. The woman slowly finished the last bite of her sandwich, while Lucy happily explained how she had earned a perfect score on her spelling test that morning. Ethan listened with the kind of attention that made every word his daughter spoke seem important. The woman watched the exchange in silence, realizing she had spent years attending executive meetings where people competed to be heard. Yet this ordinary father gave his full attention to an 8-year-old as though nothing else in the world deserved it more. "Can I show you something?" Lucy asked excitedly. The woman smiled. "I would love to." Lucy opened her backpack and carefully pulled out a drawing folded inside a blue homework folder. It showed a small apartment building beneath a bright summer sky. Beside it stood a man wearing a blue work shirt while holding the hand of a little girl. Above them, written in large, uneven letters, were the words, "My dad fixes everything." The woman studied the picture for several seconds before looking at Ethan. "That is a wonderful title." Ethan laughed softly. "She thinks I can fix almost anything." Lucy quickly corrected him. "Because you can." Ethan gently shook his head. "Not everything." His daughter smiled with complete confidence. "You always try." Those 3 simple words lingered in the room long after Lucy returned the drawing to her backpack. The woman lowered her coffee cup and quietly asked, "How long have you been raising her by yourself?" Ethan answered with the same calm honesty that seemed natural to him. "Almost 7 years." He offered no dramatic explanation and no request for sympathy. Some days are easier than others. Most days are worth every minute. Before she could respond, an elderly resident slowly entered the lobby carrying 2 heavy grocery bags. Ethan immediately stood. Excuse me for just a minute. Without hesitation, he took both bags from the woman's hands and walked her toward the elevator. Mrs. Henderson, did your knee feel any better after therapy? The elderly woman smiled gratefully. Much better, thanks to you fixing that loose stair rail last week. Ethan simply nodded. I was glad to help. He refused the $10 bill she quietly tried to hand him. Please keep it, he said kindly. You will need it more than I do. The woman sitting across the lobby noticed everything. No audience. No praise. No expectation of recognition. He behaved exactly the same way when nobody important appeared to be watching. A few minutes later, Ethan returned to his chair as though nothing unusual had happened. Sorry about that, he said. Residents come first. She looked at him thoughtfully. You seem to know everyone here. Ethan smiled. Buildings are made of concrete and steel. Communities are made of people. I work on both. Before she could answer, the front doors suddenly opened. Harold Bennett, the property manager, walked briskly into the lobby carrying a clipboard. Ethan, apartment 412 has a leaking kitchen faucet whenever you have a chance. Ethan stood immediately. I will take care of it. Harold finally noticed the elegantly dressed woman sitting nearby, but assumed she was simply another visitor. Welcome, he said politely before continuing toward his office. Ethan reached for his toolbox and looked apologetically at her. I need about 20 minutes. She nodded. I understand. Lucy looked up hopefully. You can wait with me if you want. Dad always comes back. The woman smiled at the little girl before quietly agreeing. She had lost her office, her authority, her phone, and nearly every symbol of success that morning. Yet somehow, sitting inside a modest apartment building with a trusting child and a maintenance supervisor who quietly served everyone around him, she felt safer than she had inside the executive suite, where her name still occupied the highest office in the city. 20 minutes passed more quickly than anyone expected. Lucy colored quietly at a small table near the lobby window, while the woman watched residents come and go with an easy familiarity that felt strangely comforting. Every person who entered greeted Ethan by name, even though he was nowhere in sight. A delivery driver asked where he was because a package had arrived too early. A college student thanked him for repairing a broken washing machine the previous evening. A retired veteran stopped only long enough to leave a small bag of fresh tomatoes from his garden with a handwritten note that simply read, "Thank you for always helping." The woman found herself smiling at each small exchange. Success had taught her how to manage thousands of employees, negotiate billion-dollar contracts, and stand before shareholders with confidence. But she suddenly wondered whether she had forgotten something far simpler. Respect that was earned one person at a time. The elevator doors opened, and Ethan stepped out carrying his toolbox over one shoulder. His sleeves were slightly damp from repairing the leaking faucet, yet his expression remained as calm as when he had first approached her outside. Sorry to keep you waiting, he said. She shook her head gently. I do not think I have ever spent 20 minutes learning so much without anyone giving a presentation. Ethan laughed softly. Apartment buildings have a way of teaching people patience. Before either of them could continue, the quiet rhythm of the lobby changed. Through the large glass entrance, 3 black luxury sport utility vehicles pulled to the curb across the street in front of Hawthorne Plaza. Their doors opened almost simultaneously. Men and women wearing dark business suits stepped onto the sidewalk with urgent expressions, scanning the sidewalks and nearby buildings as though searching for someone important. One of them pointed directly toward the residential building. Harold Bennett looked up from behind the front desk. Looks like somebody important is visiting the neighborhood. Ethan glanced outside before returning his attention to tightening the latch on a loose lobby cabinet door. Maybe they are looking for a tenant. The woman remained completely silent. She recognized several faces immediately. Nathan Brooks, the company's executive vice president. 2 members of the corporate legal team. Her executive assistant. Even the chairman's personal driver had arrived. Within seconds, the front doors opened again. Nathan entered first, breathing heavily from crossing the street. His anxious eyes swept across the lobby until they landed on the woman sitting quietly beside Lucy. Relief instantly replaced panic. Ms. Hayes, he exclaimed. Every conversation inside the lobby stopped. Harold froze with a stack of resident files still in his hands. The delivery driver turned slowly toward the seating area. Even Lucy looked up from her coloring book in surprise. Nathan hurried forward. We have been looking everywhere for you. Your phone is still upstairs. The board meeting has been suspended. Everyone is waiting. Ethan looked from Nathan to the woman sitting across from him. For the first time that afternoon, confusion crossed his face. Ms. Hayes. Nathan seemed equally confused that anyone present would not recognize her. This is Victoria Hayes, he said, almost in disbelief. Chief Executive Officer of Hayes Technologies. Silence settled over the lobby so completely that even the soft hum of the vending machine became noticeable. Harold's eyes widened. The delivery driver quietly removed his baseball cap. Lucy looked at Ethan and whispered, "Dad, does that mean she is the boss?" Ethan nodded slowly but kept his eyes on Victoria instead of Nathan. Nothing about his expression changed. He did not suddenly become nervous. He did not apologize for treating her like an ordinary stranger. He simply smiled with the same quiet kindness he had shown from the beginning. "I suppose that explains why everyone has been looking for you," he said gently. Victoria looked at him for a long moment before answering with the smallest grateful smile. "Yes," she replied softly. "But somehow today, that is the least important thing about me." The stunned silence inside the lobby lasted only a few seconds before Nathan stepped closer, his voice filled with urgency. "Ms. Hayes, everyone is waiting upstairs. The emergency board meeting cannot continue without you. We need to leave immediately." Victoria remained seated. She looked toward Ethan instead of the executives who had spent the last 20 minutes searching the city for her. "One moment," she replied calmly. Nathan hesitated, clearly surprised. Never in his years of working beside her had he seen Victoria delay a board meeting for anything. The legal team exchanged uncertain glances while Harold quietly lowered the resident files onto the front desk, still trying to process what had just unfolded inside his ordinary apartment building. Lucy looked from one adult to another before tugging gently on Ethan's sleeve. "Dad?" she whispered. "Is she in trouble?" Ethan knelt beside his daughter with the same reassuring smile he always wore. "I do not think so. Sometimes grown-ups simply have difficult days." Victoria heard every word. She closed her eyes briefly, realizing that not once since meeting Ethan had he spoken to her with fear, admiration, or hidden ambition. Even after discovering who she really was, he still treated her exactly the same. That realization weighed more heavily on her heart than the events that had forced her out of the tower earlier that afternoon. She slowly stood and faced everyone gathered in the lobby. "Before I leave," she said, "there is something I would like to say." Every conversation stopped again. Nathan folded his hands respectfully while the attorneys quietly stepped back. Victoria looked directly at Ethan. "When I walked out of that building today, I was no longer a chief executive officer in anyone's eyes. I was simply a woman standing alone on a sidewalk while strangers decided what kind of person I must be." She paused for a moment before continuing. "Many people watched. Many people judged. Only one person crossed the street to ask whether I was all right." Ethan shifted uncomfortably. Anyone would have done the same. Victoria smiled gently and shook her head. "No, they did not." Her eyes briefly filled with emotion before she continued speaking. "You offered me coffee without asking my name. You shared lunch that belonged to you and your daughter. You gave me a quiet place to breathe without expecting anything in return. Even after learning who I am, you have not treated me any differently." She looked around the lobby. That is the kind of respect every person hopes to receive, whether they lead a company or clean a hallway. Nobody spoke. Nathan lowered his eyes. Harold slowly nodded to himself. Even the delivery driver standing near the entrance seemed deeply moved. Ethan answered with quiet honesty. "Titles tell us what someone does. They do not tell us how someone should be treated." Victoria repeated his words softly. "Exactly." She stepped closer and extended her hand. Ethan accepted it politely. "Thank you," she said. "Today you reminded me of something I should never have forgotten." Ethan smiled. "I only offered a little kindness." Victoria shook her head once more. "Kindness always feels little to the person giving it. It rarely feels little to the person receiving it." Nathan finally spoke again, this time with far more humility than before. "Ms. Hayes, the board is ready whenever you are." Victoria nodded, but before turning toward the entrance, she looked at Lucy. "Thank you for sharing your lunch with me." Lucy smiled brightly. "Dad says sandwiches taste better when nobody eats alone." Victoria laughed softly through grateful eyes. "Your father is raising someone very wise." As the executives escorted Victoria toward the waiting vehicles outside, She glanced back one final time. Ethan had already picked up his toolbox and returned to adjusting the loose cabinet latch he had been repairing before everything changed. The man who had unknowingly shown compassion to one of the most powerful women in the city had quietly gone back to fixing small things, never realizing that the greatest thing he had repaired that afternoon was someone else's faith in humanity. The city lights had already begun reflecting across the glass towers by the time Ethan finished his final maintenance request for the evening. Most residents had returned to their apartments for dinner, and the once busy lobby had settled into its familiar peaceful rhythm. Lucy sat behind the front desk coloring another picture while Harold Bennett finished reviewing maintenance reports. Nothing about the building suggested that only a few hours earlier it had quietly become the center of an extraordinary story. Ethan locked the maintenance storage room, wiped his hands with an old work towel, and smiled at his daughter. Ready to head home? Lucy nodded enthusiastically before placing her crayons inside her backpack. Just as they reached the front entrance, a sleek black sedan slowly pulled to the curb outside. Harold glanced through the glass doors and quietly raised an eyebrow. That is not one of our residents. The rear passenger door opened, and Victoria Hayes stepped onto the sidewalk wearing the same charcoal business suit, though the strain that had shadowed her face earlier had softened into quiet determination. Nathan remained inside the vehicle while the driver respectfully stayed behind the wheel. Victoria walked toward the entrance carrying a small white bakery box tied with a blue ribbon. Ethan looked genuinely surprised. "Ms. Hayes." She smiled warmly. "I hope I am not interrupting your evening." Ethan shook his head. "Not at all." Lucy immediately recognized her and waved excitedly. "You came back." Victoria laughed softly. "I promised myself I would." Harold politely excused himself and disappeared into his office, sensing the conversation was personal. Victoria held out the bakery box. "I realized I left without properly thanking both of you." Ethan looked at the box before gently shaking his head. "You really did not need to bring anything." She smiled. "I know." Lucy's curious eyes remained fixed on the ribbon. Victoria noticed and knelt to her height. "Would you help me open it?" Lucy eagerly untied the ribbon while Ethan watched with quiet amusement. Inside rested a beautiful apple pie from one of Chicago's most famous bakeries. Lucy's eyes grew wide. "It is pretty." Ethan smiled. "It certainly is." Victoria looked toward him. "After I returned to the office, someone told me this bakery makes the best apple pie in the city." Lucy glanced between the elegant pie and her father before innocently saying, "My dad's pie is still better." Ethan laughed quietly, slightly embarrassed. "Lucy." Victoria smiled with genuine curiosity instead of polite agreement. "Your father bakes?" Lucy nodded proudly. "Every Sunday. It is our tradition." Victoria looked at Ethan with surprise. "I did not know that." Ethan shrugged modestly. "Nothing special. It is just something we enjoy together." Victoria remained thoughtful for a moment before speaking. "Do you know what happened after I returned today?" Ethan shook his head. "No. The board discovered that the accusations against me were based on incomplete information. The entire situation was corrected before sunset." Ethan smiled sincerely. "I am glad." She studied his face carefully. There was no curiosity about corporate politics. No interest in executive drama. Only quiet relief that someone else's difficult day had improved. "You are not going to ask what happened?" she asked with a gentle smile. Ethan answered exactly as she had begun expecting. "If you want to tell me, I will listen. If you do not, that is all right too." Victoria lowered her eyes for a brief moment. For years she had been surrounded by people desperate to know every detail of her business decisions because they hoped to gain something from them. Standing in front of her now was the first man who seemed interested only in her well-being. She slowly looked back up. "Would you allow me to buy you and Lucy dinner one evening?" Ethan hesitated, not because he doubted her intentions, but because he carefully considered every commitment involving his daughter. Lucy looked up hopefully without saying a word. Ethan smiled gently. "As long as it is somewhere Lucy can order grilled cheese if she changes her mind." Victoria laughed from the heart for the first time that entire day. "I think that can be arranged." As the evening breeze drifted between the apartment building and the towering office across the street, neither of them realized that what had begun as a simple act of kindness between strangers had quietly become the first honest conversation of a relationship built not on power, wealth, or status, but on respect that neither success nor failure could ever change. 3 evenings later, the small neighborhood restaurant Ethan had chosen looked nothing like the places where Victoria usually hosted investors or international clients. The booths were upholstered in faded red vinyl. Framed photographs of Chicago from decades earlier covered the walls, and the smell of fresh bread and tomato soup welcomed every customer who stepped inside. It was the kind of family restaurant where waitresses remembered children's names and nobody cared what kind of car waited outside. Victoria arrived a few minutes early wearing simple jeans and a light blue sweater instead of an expensive business suit. More than one person glanced in her direction, but nobody recognized the woman whose face had appeared in business magazines across the country. She smiled to herself, realizing how peaceful anonymity could feel. Ethan and Lucy entered together moments later. Lucy waved enthusiastically. "You came." Victoria stood with a warm smile. "I promised I would." Ethan pulled out a chair for his daughter before taking his own seat across from Victoria. The waitress approached carrying 3 menus. "Good evening, folks. Can I start everyone with something to drink?" Lucy immediately looked at Victoria. "The grilled cheese is really good." Victoria laughed. "Then I think I already know what I am ordering." Ethan smiled. "You do not have to copy Lucy." Victoria gently folded her menu closed. Sometimes the best recommendations come from people who are honest. Throughout dinner, the conversation wandered far away from board meetings and corporate reports. Lucy talked about school, her favorite library books, and the stray orange cat that often slept beside their apartment building. Ethan shared funny stories about residents who accidentally locked themselves out of their apartments. Victoria listened far more than she spoke, finding herself smiling at moments that would have seemed ordinary to everyone else, but somehow felt extraordinary to her. Halfway through the meal, Lucy excused herself to wash her hands, leaving Ethan and Victoria alone for the first time. Victoria looked around the restaurant before speaking quietly. "I cannot remember the last time I ate dinner without someone asking me to approve a budget or solve a problem." Ethan rested his hands around his coffee mug. "Do you miss it?" She considered the question carefully. "Some parts, but not tonight." Ethan nodded with understanding. "Life has a strange way of reminding us what matters." Victoria smiled gently. "May I ask you something?" "Of course." "That afternoon outside my building, why did you walk across the street?" Ethan looked through the restaurant window for a moment before answering. "Because everyone else stayed where they were." She waited quietly as he continued. "When my wife passed away, I learned something difficult. The hardest moments in life are usually surrounded by crowds. People notice your pain, but they assume someone else will help. I promised myself that if I ever saw someone standing alone, I would not become another person who simply watched." Victoria lowered her eyes, deeply moved by the quiet honesty in his voice. "I did not know." Ethan offered a peaceful smile. "Most people do not. I usually do not talk about it." At that moment, Lucy returned carrying 3 small paper napkins she had carefully folded into uneven flowers. She placed one beside each plate. "Now the table looks happier," she announced proudly. Victoria stared at the tiny paper flower beside her glass before whispering, "It certainly does." After dinner, they walked together along the quiet sidewalk beneath rows of glowing streetlights. The autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves while Lucy skipped a few steps ahead, humming softly to herself. Victoria slowed her pace beside Ethan. "Thank you for letting me be part of your evening." Ethan smiled. "It was just dinner." She gently shook her head. "No, it was something I have not had in a very long time." He looked at her with quiet curiosity. "What was that?" Victoria watched Lucy laughing as she chased her own shadow beneath the streetlights. A peaceful smile appeared across her face. "A place where nobody expected anything from me except that I simply show up." For the first time in many years, the successful chief executive officer and the hard-working single father walked side by side, without feeling separated by the distance between their worlds, because both of them had quietly discovered that the strongest connections were never built by status, but by the simple courage to make another person feel seen. Nearly 2 weeks passed before Victoria asked Ethan for one small favor. "There is an employee appreciation evening on Friday," she said over the phone. "Would you and Lucy come as my guests?" Ethan hesitated. "I'm not sure we would fit into an event like that." Victoria answered with gentle certainty. "That is exactly why I hope you will come." Friday evening arrived with clear skies over downtown Chicago. The ballroom inside Hayes Technologies had been transformed with warm lighting, fresh flowers, and round tables filled with employees from every department. Engineers, receptionists, maintenance staff, accountants, and executives shared the same room without the usual walls created by job titles. Soft piano music floated through the air, while conversations blended into a steady, welcoming hum. Ethan adjusted the sleeves of his navy jacket as he entered beside Lucy, who wore a simple blue dress and held his hand tightly. Victoria greeted them near the entrance with a warm smile instead of a formal handshake. "You both look wonderful." Lucy looked around the enormous ballroom with wide eyes. "This place is beautiful." Victoria smiled. "I am glad you came." Nathan Brooks quietly approached and greeted Ethan with genuine respect. "Mr. Carter, it is good to see you again." Ethan nodded politely. "Thank you." The difference in Nathan's tone did not go unnoticed by several executives standing nearby. Only days earlier, many of them had viewed Ethan as nothing more than an ordinary maintenance supervisor from across the street. Now they understood why their chief executive officer had personally invited him. As dinner concluded, the lights softened and Victoria stepped onto the stage. The applause that welcomed her filled the ballroom before gradually fading into complete silence. She looked across the hundreds of employees gathered before her, then placed both hands lightly on the podium. "Tonight," she began, "we usually celebrate company achievements, successful projects, and financial milestones. Those accomplishments matter. But recently, I was reminded that the greatest success any organization can achieve cannot be measured on a quarterly report." Curious whispers quickly disappeared as everyone listened. Victoria continued calmly. 2 weeks ago, I experienced one of the most difficult afternoons of my professional life. For a brief period, I walked out of this building without my office, my phone, or even my identity badge. Hundreds of people saw me standing outside. Most simply continued walking. She paused before looking toward Ethan, who sat quietly beside Lucy near the back of the ballroom. One man crossed the street. Every head slowly turned in Ethan's direction. He immediately looked uncomfortable with the attention, lowering his eyes while Lucy gently squeezed his hand. Victoria smiled softly before continuing. "He did not know my position. He did not know my salary. He did not know my name. He only knew that someone appeared to be having a difficult day." The ballroom remained completely silent. "He shared his lunch with me. His daughter welcomed me without hesitation. He offered respect before he knew whether I deserved admiration, and kindness before he knew whether I could ever repay it." Several employees quietly nodded while others lowered their eyes in reflection. Victoria stepped away from the podium and walked down from the stage until she stood only a few feet from Ethan. "Mr. Ethan Carter," she said warmly, "would you please join me?" The room filled with applause as Ethan slowly stood. He looked at Lucy, who smiled proudly before whispering, "Go, Dad." Ethan walked to the front with the same quiet humility he carried every day while repairing faucets, changing light fixtures, and helping residents across the street. Victoria turned toward the audience once more. "This man reminded me that leadership does not begin in the executive office. It begins the moment someone chooses compassion when nobody is watching." She reached into her jacket pocket and unfolded the small paper napkin flower Lucy had made during dinner at the neighborhood restaurant. Holding it carefully for everyone to see, she smiled through grateful eyes. Some gifts look insignificant. Some lessons arrive without warning. Yet the smallest acts of kindness often become the strongest foundation on which respect, trust, and hope are built. As the entire ballroom rose to its feet in a long-standing ovation, Ethan looked around with quiet disbelief, realizing that he was not being honored for wealth, influence, or achievement, but simply because on one ordinary afternoon he had treated a stranger with the dignity every human being deserves. The applause inside the ballroom continued long after Ethan quietly returned to his seat beside Lucy. He leaned toward his daughter with a slightly embarrassed smile. "I think they clapped much longer than I deserved." Lucy reached over and slipped her small hand into his. "They were not clapping because you fixed things, Dad. They were clapping because you are you." Ethan looked at her for a moment before gently kissing the top of her head. Victoria watched the exchange from across the room and smiled, realizing that the greatest measure of a parent was not the career they built, but the character they quietly passed to the next generation. In the weeks that followed, life returned to a familiar rhythm, although something important had changed. Victoria no longer rushed through every day surrounded by meetings and schedules without noticing the people around her. She often crossed the street during lunch just to visit the apartment building where Ethan worked. Sometimes she brought fresh coffee. Other times she simply sat in the lobby while Lucy finished homework at the small table near the window. Residents gradually stopped seeing her as the famous chief executive officer from the tower across the street. To them, she became the kind woman who remembered birthdays, carried grocery bags for older neighbors, and always greeted everyone by name. Ethan never tried to impress her. He continued replacing broken light fixtures, repairing leaking pipes, and helping anyone who needed an extra hand. Victoria admired that more with each passing day because she understood something many successful people never learned. A person who remains humble after receiving respect possesses a strength that cannot be purchased. One bright Saturday afternoon, near the beginning of spring, Lucy stood outside the apartment building holding a small potted maple tree wrapped in burlap. "Are we really planting it here?" she asked excitedly. Victoria nodded. "If your father agrees." Ethan smiled as he accepted the shovel from Harold Bennett, who had happily offered a quiet corner beside the entrance where residents often gathered. Together they dug a small hole while several neighbors watched from nearby benches. Mrs. Henderson clapped softly when Lucy carefully lowered the young tree into the ground. "It will grow with all of us," she said proudly. Victoria gently brushed a little dirt from Lucy's sleeve before looking at Ethan. "Trees are interesting," she said. "People notice how tall they become, but everything depends on roots nobody can see." Ethan looked at the newly planted maple before quietly answering. "People are not much different." Months later, the young tree had already begun growing strong green leaves, and every morning Ethan unlocked the front doors while Lucy hurried toward school. Victoria often met them on the sidewalk after walking from her office across the street, instead of using the private underground entrance reserved for executives. One morning she reached Ethan just as he finished adjusting the welcome mat outside the building. Without saying a word, she slipped her hand gently into his. He looked at her with the same calm smile he had worn the afternoon they first met. No cameras recorded the moment. No reporters stood nearby. Nobody applauded. Lucy looked up at both of them and smiled as though the picture had always been meant to look exactly this way. Together they crossed the sidewalk toward the apartment building where everything had begun. Residents waved from balconies above while neighbors greeted them with familiar smiles. Across the street, the shining office tower still carried Victoria's name high above the city skyline, but she no longer measured success by the height of the building that represented her career. She measured it by the quiet man walking beside her, the little girl laughing between them, and the simple truth that had changed all three of their lives forever. The world often teaches people to recognize power before character, wealth before kindness, and titles before humanity. Yet on one ordinary afternoon, a single father chose to see a lonely stranger instead of a position, and because of that one quiet decision, 3 lives discovered that dignity freely given has the remarkable power to become love freely returned.